Okay, so 6.2, the Western Front. Your objective for today is that students will be able to explain westward expansion with a focus on the role of railroads and impact on the American Indians. So the Transcontinental Railroad was a railroad that went across the United States. So prior to the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, you used to have to do a combination of railroad or horse and buggy to get across from one coast to the other coast. The Transcontinental Railroad was typically built by mostly immigrants, mostly Chinese immigrants and Irish. There were two railroads that built it. The Central Pacific Railroad started from the west and went east, where the Union Pacific started in the east and went west. And it was finally completed in May of 1869, which is this picture right here. And it was completed at what we call Promontory Point, Utah. And some important information to know about the railroad is that there was a huge increase in the population of the West because now it was so much easier to get there. So it made settling in the West much more desirable. So one result of the railroad expanding west was frontier life. So this is going to be a result of westward expansion and more people moving westward. Now, because you have more people moving, it's obviously going to have an effect on the land and the people living there. So people moved to the Great Plains, which is the area west of the Midwest, but east of the California mountain ranges. And it's thousands of miles of dry, desolate plains. People used to think of this as unfarmable because the land was so bad. But it was home to many Native Americans and bison who lived on the Great Plains. But then we had people discover gold in the Great Plains. And this is what essentially led us to the gold rush, which many of you are familiar with, and people that we called prospectors, who were people that were looking for gold in moving to the Great Plains. So they moved west. So that was the first group that you had moving westward. In addition to that, though, you also had a lot of cattle ranches because the land was bad. So the first group that we had living in the Great Plains were the Native Americans. The second group that we had living there were miners and prospectors. Okay, and then the third and final group that lived there were cattle ranches. Remember, farmland was bad, but you could raise cattle. Oh, we'll say, but good for cattle. Good for cattle. Now, two effects of the cattle ranches. One, you had a large group of cowboys that would herd and manage the cattle. And this is where Chicago plays a big role in this. So what they were able to do because of the Continental Railroad is they were able to then move the cattle to Chicago, where it was going to be butchered, and then moved and sold other places. On the East Coast. Now, another thing that's important about these cattle ranches and the cowboys, and was one thing that made it easier, was what we call barbed wire. It was an important invention for the cattle ranches. However, this all led to a huge decrease in the American bison, or the American buffalo. So it was great for the cattle ranchers because they could keep their cattle in, but the increase in cattle led to decreased bison because they would eat the resources, but also having barbed wire everywhere really disrupted the travel patterns of bison. In addition to that, Americans would hunt them for sport and game, and it had a huge impact on the overall bison population. So in addition to the railroad, the second thing to increase westward expansion, so this is the second item to increase westward expansion, was the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act as well. So the Homestead Act was, and this is a picture of the Homestead Act. That's an actual document from the Homestead Act. You can see this was written in 1868. But the Homestead Act was approved in 1862. And it would give you 160 acres if you lived there for 5 years. And this was anywhere west of the Mississippi. So they were trying to encourage westward expansion. They're trying to get people to move out west. And they said, you can have 160 acres as long as you live there for 5 years. So you can actually see all that right here. 5 years and 160. And it looks like, it tells us the, where it's located, but I don't exactly know where that is, unfortunately. So that's one copy of it. The Morrill Act was the federal government gave states 30,000 acres of land for them to sell. The states could then use that money to create colleges, specifically for agriculture. And so, and this again was another draw for people because now you could go out west and also get an education. Okay, so the effect of all of this westward expansion had a huge impact on the Plains Indians. Were very much impacted by westward expansion. The first part of that was the buffalo. So this was their main food. It was a good food source and just good resource in general because they would use all parts of the buffalo. And by 1889, only 541 buffalo remained. This was down from by thousands of buffalo. So if you can imagine over the coast or over the entire Western Plains, that only 541 buffalo remained. It was hard to find buffalo, whereas once they used to be able to find them very easily. So a good food source for them, but also just a good resource for them was now no longer. So now they were stuck in a position where they didn't have the resources that they had typically had to survive. And so many were forced to move to reservations. So they felt like they had no choice due to lack of resources. So obviously this led to a lot of tension and conflict. Here the Native Americans now are losing their resources, are being forced onto reservations. So it's causing a lot of conflict. And then to add fuel to the fire, if you would, they found gold in the Black Hills. So the Black Hills was Indian territory. So because they found gold in the Black Hills, many prospectors came looking for gold. So Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were two Indian leaders. Who tried to stop Americans on their territory or on their land, which led us to Custer's last stand. So General Custer came to the Black Hills with troops. They were in an altercation. They got into a fight with Sitting Bull. And Crazy Horse. And every one of Custer's men were killed, for the exception of a horse who apparently had gotten away. And so that was called Custer's Last Stand. So this again continued to add to the tension and create tension between Americans and natives that lived on the land. One way to try to address this was what we call the Dawes Severalty Act, which was the Indians were given land and made citizens if they lived on the reservations. But again, the tension continued, which led us eventually to Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee was when there was a group of Indians who before it was called the Ghost Ants. And while they were performing the ghost dance, some nearby troops fired upon them. And shot and killed 290 men, women, and children. And so this whole movement westward had a huge impact on the cultures that already lived there without a whole lot of thought from us on what that might look like.